And welcome to another exciting You Know What? The Bald Explorer reads a book to a lovely audience who's waiting there just for him to read. It's very nice of you to pop by on this Friday, the 19th of June 2020, at just after 4 o'clock here in the UK. And we are reading the story of a Norfolk farm by Henry Williamson over there in Norfolk, where they don't talk like this at all. But as I don't know how a Norfolk thing does, everybody gets a little bit of West Country. Sorry, same old thing with the old Voby, one-eyed Kenobi, but very nice. Anyway, let's say hello to a few people. Hello to Michael Angel and to Ernie the Milkman. Thank you, Ernie, for the little private email that you sent me, although all email is private, really, by default, unless it's obviously being copied to other people. But there, a lovely picture he sent with Dame Vera Lynn, who sadly died yesterday, I think it was, and she was 103, wasn't she? Yeah, very nice picture, and also of your father-in-law, John, who stumbled across during the Second World War a plane crash of a German plane, and a rather gruesome boot fell out with, I don't know whether the leg was still attached to it, but yeah, rather gruesome. Anyway, that was thanks for the audio of him telling that. That was really nice. The lovely Julia, hello to you. To Ernie the Milkman, oh, I've just said that. To Michael Angel again, yes, thank you. Linda Kane, and to Days of Yore, to Graham Cass, to Adrian Turbostream, to Lee Lawson. Hello, managed another live one. At last for a while I make some soup. Oh, marvellous. Well, I've got some bread, but unfortunately I ran out of time before I could get to the second kneading, so it's just going to go boop, and then I shall knead it and shove it in the oven. Yeah, so there we go. Ed Loud, good afternoon. Paul Smith, good afternoon to you. Very nice to see you. All of you, thank you very much. And Dig of the Dump, work down there. Guess what the farmer said when we took a wrong turning? Get off my land, you beggar! Get off my land! You can't come on here, you know. It's private property, this is. Private property. You don't have no daughter of mine in this house with an artificial leg. Thank you. The world's tallest loaf. Brrr. Yes, I'm just getting myself all psyched up for the Vogue show tonight with the lovely Julia. And I'm just going to show you a little preview of what it's going to look like, because I worked on this earlier today. Look. Bink. There we are, look. That's all ready for the Vogue show tonight, but that's on another channel, ladies and gentlemen. That's on another channel, so don't get too excited. We are reading... Oh, yeah. Yes, we are. The story of a Norfolk farm. That's nice. It is nice. Thank you. Very nice. Who's that? It's voice off screen. Right. Dig of the Dump. All true. Get off my land, you beggar. This is chapter 11. Oh, nice. Oh, nice. My manager arrives. Let's try and be serious for the reading of this, for those poor people that come along to the reading just to listen, and then they get the verbs being a bit silly. Wow, that looks great, says the lovely Julia. Oh, by the way, and lovely Julia, just so you know, that hole, that side, is for you. That is where you will be appearing. So, make sure you're there, basically. Sam arrived unexpectedly 6 hours earlier than he had telephoned. I had planned to greet him with a great wood fire in the open hearth, the traveller from African suns, with a 2-year Devon bullock steak grilled on the embers by 7 p.m. and a room-warmed bottle of Algerian wine. Instead, another telegram, delivered just before noon, announced his arrival on a train a few minutes after noon. As the train drew into the platform with its single line and oil lamps and rambler roses climbing over the faded station name board, I found it difficult to face Sam. I withdrew into the little goods room and watched all the tall, big-headed strangers wearing glasses and an unfamiliar long and grey overcoat. Oh, sorry, I watched a tall, big-headed stranger. That cost me to be silly at the head, thinking I'm all confident and everything. And here we are, tripping over the words as ever. Tripping over the words. I withdrew into the small little goods room and watched a tall, big-headed stranger wearing glasses and an unfamiliar long and heavy greatcoat carefully descending from a narrow carriage door, opening mouth to say "Ha!" to a flushing, smiling Letitia, and shaking her gravely by the hand. I had a desire to remain aloof, together with a forced urge to which tried to smother this desire. Together with a forced urge to try to smother this desire and make me go forward and greet the stranger with the geniality and welcome customary in England towards one's guests. The result was a compromise, a hesitant moving forward with expressionless face and a hello, which probably appeared to have geniality forced in it. Was this grave, soft-spoken, diffident stranger the Sam that I had seen off from Tilbury docks a whole world time ago? The large hand seemed to enclose all of mine. I found it difficult to say anything real, so I inquired about the journey from Liverpool, scarcely heeding the answer. Sam was very attentive to my remarks, but I felt that he too was constrained. That evening, the reserve still being between us, I tried to account to Sam for some of the supposed eccentricities and vagaries of my sort of person. Once, I said, in the days of working as a reporter on a Sunday newspaper, I had met a clear and authentic genius. He was a Polish boy who was a phenomenal chess player. He was only 10 years old, but already he had beaten most of the champion chess players in Europe. He was staying with his parents in one of the dingy rows of tall Victorian houses of St. John's Wood. His father was a peasant, smiling and round-headed. His mother was slimmer, dark, with brooding eyes, a woman of natural refinement. The child himself was at first glance not remarkable, the usual small boy in a sailor suit. But after a few moments one had the impression of power and directness coming from him, not due even in part from the fact that he knew himself to be an infant prodigy. His eyes were firm, and his gaze immediate and direct. His brow gave a sense of hard power, with the temples slightly pronounced, but beautifully balanced, as though armoured against the penetrating or disintegrating thought of others. When he was asked to feed the hens in the garden for a photograph, he strode from the room through the open French windows and scattered the grain. But when I attempted to take some, idly to throw a handful, he instantly removed the box from my reach with a look that overcame and dismayed me. I was told that he had seen a butcher's boy riding a bicycle past the house on his first day there. He had run out to watch him. It was the first bicycle he'd ever seen. He asked his manager for one, and when the boy came along the next morning, he got on the machine and, after a few hesitant moments to feel his balance, rode after the boy and overtook him. After that, no further interest in the bicycle. It was so in chess playing, I went on. The young prodigy moved from board to board of his scores of opponents, making a move, then passing on, concentrating his thought of a powerful moment, making a move again, then passing to the next problem. He had beaten as many as 50 players, all skilled men, in that one evening like this. He was mental power concentrated behind a will that swiftly turned his thought into materialization by action. He was a genius who had never been thwarted, thanks to a good-natured, complacent father and a watchful mother. Napoleon must have been such a child, though frustrated a little, thus growing to maturity with what is called a flaw in his nature or character. So you see, Sam, I concluded, the man of genius is the pure expression of natural force, though often in life his expression may be the opposite of pure. There are, too, there are too many and varied degrees of genius, ranging from pure force to a small or patchy talent of the irregular or intermittent creative artist who is usually an unhappy man, owing to the very decisive mixture of God and mammon within him. So, you see, Sam, I'm a bit of a mixture, I suppose. You might find me a bit difficult. That's why I've had to explain things. Ah, said Sam, making the only comment so far on the monologue. At this moment, Letitia came in to announce dinner. She was sorry it hadn't been possible to grill the steak on the wood fire, for it was frozen beef, and all she could get from the butcher, who came round twice a week to the hamlet. It had to be soaked in water first, and would have caused it to lose colour, and she didn't think that I would like to see it over my embers. It's all the same to me, said Sam. I'm longing simply to taste a bit of British meat again. Ah, well, it's not British, actually, I had to explain, but it comes from a chain store group tied up with hundreds of millions invested in South America. Why we have the stuff in the house, I don't know. Well, dear, said Letitia, you did say that you'd get the steak from Moulton, and also I'm trying to economise, and this is one of the ways. Ho-hum, it smells frightfully good to me, said Sam, sniffing appreciatively. By Jove, it's good to be in England again. We sat down to the first meal of our new life together. I poured 2 full glasses of Algerian wine and drank mine rapidly. I urged Sam to do the same. The bottle was soon emptied. I opened another. Sam and I were talking freely and affably about the old days. We were up on Cranmere again, in the rain and the fog, to get particulars for the Otterbook, while the motorcycle and sidecar waited miles below. Then he was talking me into a wedding at Buckland Brewer on the back of his tall pre-war motorbike, rather fast because it was late. I was clutching my new oversized top hat in one hand and an umbrella in the other, swaying round muddy corners with legs dangling and praying that Sam knew about the laws of gravity and side-slip. Without mishap, I got stiffly off the carrier, round the corner before the church. Sam was in his greasy overalls. The bride, a young London woman who had come to live in the district with her mother and sister and brothers a year or 2 before, had told me that her wedding was to be a swish one, and had warned me to appear correctly dressed, hence the tall hat and tails and striped trousers, with new boots and white spats, specially made in St. James's Street for the occasion. Something had happened about the swish, for as I joined the others, I saw myself to be the only man so dressed. The retired colonels, the village squire, and the other men guests were clad in ordinary tweeds. I felt a fool. The faultless Lincoln and Bennett of pre-war magazine fiction, ordered by post from self-measurements of my cranium, wobbled on my head, despite the several layers of newspaper stuffed into the lining. My fear was that it would fall off, disclosing the paper, or else settle down over my ears, giving me the appearance of a Yiddish comedian on a provincial music hall. Fortunately, nothing happened until after the wedding reception, when, my glass having been repeatedly filled by the bride's younger brother, I observed my hat being kicked around by the bride's younger brother. When my glass had been repeatedly filled by the bride's younger brother, I observed my hat being kicked around the lawn by a wild scrum of girls and youths in naval uniform. Evidently, I returned to Sam's house late in the afternoon, in the biker's cart, lying with mixed feelings, induced by mixed drinks among some loaves. When he goes off on a sort of little side story, he really goes off on a little side story of which it's so irrelevant to the book. Somebody needs to edit this book No disrespect to you, Henry Williamson, but to be honest, all of that, basically you just said that you got drunk and you remembered a few things from you didn't need so much detail. Anyway, I was exerting myself from these reminiscences, trying to create a flow of feeling between us. Sam, reminiscences, that's the word I was trying to say. Reminiscences. Sometimes I look at a word and I can't put the sound of the word with the actual text of the word. I don't know if other people have that issue. But reminiscences is what I was trying to say, but I was trying to read in it, and it was sort of remi-sciences. I was exerting myself from these reminiscences. See, I did it again. Look at the word, and a different word comes out. Reminiscences. Trying to create a flow of feeling between us. Sam listened agreeably, his eyes growing more and more sleepy. What had he been doing since those days, I asked. His eyes became more alert, and he told me of his adventurous tramping hundreds of miles in search of work after arriving at the Cape. He had had a tough time, being unable to get work in the electrical engineering as he lacked proper qualifications. With his brother, he had walked nearly 1,000 miles in search of work, ending up in a gold mine where they worked several months building themselves a shack on the nearby Kopi. When this failed, he and some new friends started an airport, inspired by one of them who had been an ace in the World War, he said. The ace designed the machine, and it took them about 15 months to build it in their spare time. The brothers were working at the time on a tobacco farm. As the day for the first flight came round, Sam noticed the ace was getting more and more withdrawn into himself, more mystical, and the day before the ceremony, which was to be watched by the mayor of the local town, as the beginning, they hoped, of an all-empire flying service, the ace was to be found in a condition which appeared to Sam to be that of complete intoxication. He explained, however, that he was suffering from malaria, which always affected his speech and gave him a shaking of the limbs, causing him to be unsteady on his feet and generally to be unsure of himself. It was his crash behind German lines, he declared, but he would be all right on the morrow. On the morrow he was a little better, but deadly pale as he approached the Aardvark, as the aeroplane had been christened by one of the fellow mothers. He took off with glazed eyes, and when he was near flying speed, lifted his tail too much so that he nearly went nose first into the veldt, but recovering, stuck the skid into the earth again, and after a hopping wobble left and right, rose into the air, swerved, wobbled again, and then turned over on his propeller. That was the end of 15 months' work, and after the ace had gone away, they learned that it was the first time he had flown, for during the war he had been employed inside the sheds of an aircraft factory. Oh, he'd never flown, I see. The Aardvark All-Empire Flying Service being wound up, Sam got a chance to get into the electrical engineering again. He loved the work, and at the end of 7 years was in charge of a team of men erecting transformers and grids across hundreds of miles of country. Meanwhile, he'd been working for the AMIEE to qualify himself for managership. But when I wrote about the farm, all his memories of England came to him strongly, and despite these somewhat confusing contradictions in my letters, enthusiasm and optimism, usually followed by despite the somewhat confusing contradictions in my letters, enthusiasm and optimism, usually followed by pessimism and self-criticism, he thought he could make a success of it with me, and here he was. Blimey, we didn't really need any of that either. This bloke overwrites. How many pages is in this book? No wonder it goes on for 400-odd pages. He just overwrites. I mean, it's interesting, but he does sort of meander off the story. We raised our glasses to one another. Cheerio, Sam. Cheerio, Bill. Here's to a success to the farm. Rather. We finished the bottle. Should I open another one, it would be cold and acid, and there was no point in having an aching head on the morrow. No, we would have a game of draughts instead. Did he play draughts? By Jove, yes. Anything you like, Bill. Absolutely anything you like. He was Sam of old, despite the slight greying of the hair above the ears, the large hands and thick neck. Sam, always ready to listen and sympathise, to give help at a moment's notice, to work without thought of gain, diffident, easy-going, entirely without callousness or vice. Sam wasn't tough. That was chapter 12, thank you very much. Blimey. I think people did circumlate more then. By Jove, how tickled they were. Yes, actually not bad, still cool, tomorrow will be hot. Richard's reading is so natural and unassuming, he adds a lot to the listener's experience. Thank you, George Henry, that's very kind of you. I do try to, I mean, it's very difficult because I've not read it, I haven't had the time to pre-read so that I can get over the little trips that come. Not really, but an interesting format may be useful for poems. Digger the dump. May the saints preserve us from such crass abominations. A lot of incidental detail is useful for social history. That's true. Yes, absolutely. It is true. But of course, you know, just trying to keep the story flowing, and then I'm thinking, oh right, okay, we've gone down this rabbit hole, and is he going to? I mean, clearly he manages to crawl back. Chapter 12, more preparations. The idea has been to send Sam to agricultural college to learn how to do everything. But when I learned from the first and supposedly best place I inquired of that the fees were £80 a term, agricultural colleges were off. So Sam distempered the walls of the cottage, painted doors, cupboards and window frames according to the latest plan of saving money for the farm. We were getting on, although we had not really started. Mr. Barkway had offered to supply materials to Mr. Stubberfield at Welk next to the sea railway station. Mr. Stubberfield had not replied. My new book was nearly finished. After 6 weeks of painting, Sam tackled the rats in the cottage by filling up most of the rat holes with wainscoting. As one hole was always being reopened almost as soon as it was closed by Sam, I decided to take a hand. I loaded an air rifle and sat on the sofa late one night, listening to persistent gnawing. An old rat was about to gnaw through Sam's new floorboard. I waited, tense with immobility. When its head and shoulders eventually came through, I was unable to move, not wanting to scare it, and it dragged itself across the floor and climbed my knee, to sit there for a while, washing its face with its pink hands. Such a thing, I told myself, could only happen to a writer of animal stories, but it was a fact. Sam painted and colour washed by day, while I walked and wrote and schemed and proposed and criticised. The nightly game of checkers, or draughts, had petered out. The result of every game was the same. Despite Sam's being one night the Abyssinians, or the Italians, or the weeds on the farm, or the rats in the barn, I representing the suitable adversary. I'm not quite sure what he means by that. Does he mean that he was always winning or always losing? Every letter I received dealing with the new venture was handed over for filing after he had absorbed the contents. We had 6 filing books labelled estate receipts, estate letters, farm receipts, farm letters, literary receipts, literary letters. The first 4 were Sam's affair. Oh, literary, as in the book stuff that he's writing. Sorry, that was a bit daft of me there. I was thinking, what does he mean by that? Yes, that was because he's an author. Right. We collected hundreds of catalogues and filed them during the interval before 0 hour, and filled a scrapbook with interesting articles from the Farmer and Stock Breeder. Soon we had an entire drawer full of catalogues and needed another. Sam's shirts and vests had to be wedged into the top of the drawer to make room. The catalogues, in alphabetical order, were of seeds, glass houses, well-boring apparatus, heavy caterpillar tractors, and smallest garden motor cultivators, milking machines, pumps, all sorts of implements of those I read about and had pondered. I drew a map of the farm with the 6-inch ordnance sheet and made a sketch of the buildings. I planned out where our cows would enter, be milked by electricity, and sent out again. Pig sites here, liquid manure tanks there. On paper and in imagination, the weeds were killed by chlorate, canite, slasher, pitchpole, scythe, cyanide, and bare fallow. The composition of the soils were altered. Coverts and spinneys were planted. A smoked eel industry beside the river was started. A new agricultural college for 100 pupils was inaugurated. Meanwhile, Sam worked the distemper brush and got the spots on his hair and beard, for he was now growing a beard, a big black beard at my suggestion, so that he would look the part of a manager of Old Castle Farm. When the snowdrops in the hedge bottoms opened in the January winds, the house was repainted and rewashed. The catalogues had flowed into a third drawer, while the articles clipped from the stock breeder bulged and hung ragged from the scrapbook. Meanwhile, things in Norfolk were not getting along. Mr. Barkway wrote that after more letters he could get nothing more definite from Mr. Stubberfield about the offer to deliver the materials of repair to Welk next to the sea. He had written suggesting that the work to be put out to contract... He had written suggesting that the work to be put out to contract landlord... He had written suggesting that the work to be put out to contract, landlord paying for the material... Oh, I see. There's almost like a word missing. Well, he had written... sometimes I get really wound up by a sentence which doesn't make sense to me until I've worked it out, and I apologise that it halts the proceedings. I do apologise, but I do like to find out what he means. He had written suggesting that the work to be put out to contract, comma, landlord paying for materials and the trustee paying for labour, full stop. Surely that should be, he had written suggesting that the work to be put out to contract was the landlord paying for the materials and the trustee for the labour. That's what he meant to say. To this letter also, reported Mr. Barkway, there was no satisfactory reply. Remembering Mr. Barkway's determined words in the lane between... Oh, God, here we go. Remembering Mr. Barkway's determined words in the lane between 21 acres and 14 acres, I wrote suggesting that we should get the repairs done and then distrain for the cost of the labour. When the snowdrops were wilted, the schedule of the proposed copying, the It's Friday. I want to be excused. Please, sir, can I go home now, please? Can I go home? But you've only just come in and haven't done any work. I've done 30 minutes, sir, and I've got dough in the kitchen that needs to be turned into bread, sir. No! Get back and read. Read the damn book a bit more. You are not getting away with it, Mr. Vo. But, sir, I can't read it. It doesn't make any sense. He didn't write it in easy words, did he? Where's that Peter and Jane? I want to read Peter and Jane. It's far easier. Much more easy. The other books were all right. Why is he writing in such complicated ways? When the snowdrops were wilted, the schedule of the proposed cropping for 1937 arrived. Mr. Barkway wanted me to suggest any alterations, adding that there would only be 13 acres of roots, of which 4 acres would be mangolds. Not an excessive amount if it was intended to keep any stock. Would I let him know? Sam was called in for a conference. Could he suggest anything from all the answers that he had returned to the examiners of his postal lessons? After pursuing the letter, Sam frowned. Then he said, After another pause, he said, well, it's like this. To be absolutely truthful, I've been reading so blessed much lately about farming that I've forgotten everything I thought I'd learned. Well, that's how I feel too. What is layer? I'm dashed if I know. No, nor do I. Have a cigarette, old boy. Thanks, Bill. Ignorance was a bond between us. And after all, Mr. Barkway ought to know if he was Mr. Barkway ought to know if he was reasonable or not. He ought to know that I knew nothing about farming. He was my agent. So I replied that my partner and I approved of the schedule, adding that I hoped the repairs would soon be started. Proposed schedule of croppings, Old Castle Farm, in 1937. This is laid out as a table and it's very difficult to read out loud. So he's got here categories: field, acreage, date, 1936 and in 1937. 14 acres. The field is called 14 acres. The acreage is actually 13. Barley, root. I can't even bother to look. You'll just have to look at the screen because, look, it's a table, right? It's a table. It doesn't make any sense when you try to read it out loud. So he's got a proposed schedule of cropping, which he's written out. I must find out what layer was and what were seeds. Well, he must know what seeds are. Perhaps the word was a misprint for weeds. There was a tithe of nearly £80 on the farm, so when I read in the Farmer and Stock Breeder that a tithe bill had been made law, whereby the money which previously had been paid to the church would now be paid to the government, it was immediately arresting. The government had brought out the church's interests, and nobody could sell tithed land in future without disclosing the charge upon it. That's an interesting, I mean, just going aside here for my own personal aside. So in the old days, you had a tithe and, a tenth of what you earned you'd give to the church, which was there to pay for the church and pay for the vicar and all the administrations, of which some went to the vicar, but a lot went to the body, the corporate body of the church, as far as I understand it. And the same said vicar stroke, it meant the vicar may not have even been there at the church, and the vicar may have presided over several churches, and his cleric, or whatever the other word is, the subordinate of a vicar. What's the subordinate of a vicar? Not the cleric, the clergyman, not the clergyman, I can't remember whatever the bloody name of the sodding chap is, would get then a pittance from that money. But what he's saying here, and to answer what somebody said, Morton Lewis said that it's good for social history, is that the government bought out the church's interest. So now it looks like so something that was supposed to pay for the church, this tithe, was turned into a tax given to the government. Curate, that's the word. Curate, yes, curate. Or verger, or sextant, or, miscreant is another word for them. That's just an interesting point, isn't it? That the government, I mean, whether that's still a thing or not, decided that we would take the tithe away and have it as a tax for the government. Surely they have no right to that. That's a sort of a goodwill thing. I mean, is the government then paying for who's paying for the vicar and the curate? Sexton Blake. Anyway, I just thought I'd have a bit of a, I don't know, I say you don't know. I bit of one of them, them things that I can't find the words for. I read how tithe had grown from a charitable gift of farm produce, here we go, this is exactly what I'm saying, into a parasite upon the land itself. Now, he's put that much clearer than I did. Originally, the tithe had been the farmer's free gift of corn, 1/10 of the harvest. I know my stuff. I bloody know my stuff. Look at that. To the poor of the parish. Oh, well, I thought it went to the poor bloody cleric. Not cleric, curate. If it had been administered by the parish priest as a charity, and this charity had grown to be the annual demand by the church on the farmer, who in bad seasons and depressions consequent on wars and colonial exploitation had protested until the law was made making it payable by the lander. There's a sentence that I've got lost in there somewhere because it's so bloody long. By the time the tithe was demanded as money with which to pay the stipends or wages of the parish priests, who no longer gave it to the... Again, by this time, tithe was demanded as money with which to pay the stipends or wages of the parish priests, who no longer gave it to the poor. Right, that's what I'm saying. They paid the wages of the thing and took the rest for themselves. Now, at last, tithe was commuted to gilt-edged stock and vested in the ecclesiastical commissioners. And if the landowner did not pay up twice yearly, he could be summoned to the county court, and if he did not pay then, his household goods could be seized and turned out on the lawn and sold at knockdown prices without reserve to the highest bidder. Thus, the parasite, which had started its life of charity in the bowels of human compassion, had now worked its way up into the skull of its host, the land of England. No wonder Commander Trelawney, paying £80 a year tithe and income tax at 6 shillings and sixpence in the pounds on his rent of £100 plus land tax, plus land tax at 1 shilling in the pound, and drainage rates as well, had wanted to get rid of the land. But when I bought that land, I knew the tithe bill was overdue to become law. The scale of payments had last been fixed in the high prices for corn following the Great War. Barley was then 60 shillings a coombe. Now it was 8 shillings for ordinary, the 25 shillings for the best malting grain. The Tithe Act was passed, and one of the clauses which immediately affected me as the new owner was that which knocked off all payments in excess of the third of the rent or rentable value. Thus the tithe in future would be only 1/3 of £100 or £33 6 shillings and 8pence. It would mean an annual saving of about £46, which at 5% would mean a capital value of £920. Thus, Oldcastle Farm was worth about £900 more than I had paid for it. Phew! Right, we drank another bottle of Reg Algerian wine that night. I'm not bloody surprised. Crikey, how you ever can work any of that out. But there we are. How are we doing on the time? I'm going to finish shortly, I think. But in the middle of the night, I recalled an important point in the stock breeder article. Oh no, here we go. Unless the annual value of the land was certified by the tax inspector of the district and the certificate sent to the Tithe Redemption Commission in London by March the 1st, that 40-odd quid would not be knocked off. Mr. Barkway was my agent. Ought I remind him? Would he think me a nuisance? By the light of a candle, I reread the article as the clock was striking 2. Yes, it was so. No remission unless it were applied for by March the 1st. So I wrote to Mr. Barkway, and after apologising for troubling him, suggested that the application should be made immediately. The reply came back a few days later. We will in due course deal with the remission of the tithe when the April instalment comes due. But it would be too late then, so I sent in the particulars of the new act, and again I mentioned I was hoping that the repairs would be started soon. 3 weeks later, Sam filed a letter that seemed to at last indicate a move forward. As regard the dilapidations, Mr. Strawless's trustee is declining to face up to his liabilities, and if he does not alter his tone very shortly, I shall have to deal with him rather differently. The daffodils were rising over the seed pods of the snowdrops, and there was a run of salmon in the bank-high green waters of the river. I wouldn't have time to fish this season. The fishing must be let. Should I reserve a rod for myself? No, for then I would have to fish, and if I didn't fish, it would irk me. For 2 years at least, probably 3, there would be no time, which was energy for such things. After 3 years, Sam would be trained, and I would go away and lie in the sun on some far sandy shore and idle by a trout stream, and find the freedom I had not known since the old days of Skier Cottage. I wrote out an advertisement, and the fishing was let. With the money, I would buy an old lorry. We wanted a large trailer too, one that could be towed by the lorry and be of use on the farm afterwards. And Sam looked round the districts for a suitable truck. The idea was to take the tools I had stored for Sam from the old works, Papa's carpenter's bench, etc., and lathes, to Creek, together with a load of yew wood I had bought from the sawmills. This beautiful salmon-pink timber was to have been cut for gateposts, but I bought it in time, and had the trunks sawn into planks for a staircase in the house, should we one day build on Castle Hills. There was about 1.5 tons. We must take the sailing dinghy too, which had lain for 5 years in the boat builder's yard in the estuary. The lorry must have tipping gear because we wanted to make up the roads. Was there a pit somewhere near Creek with suitable stones or gravel for road making? I thought I'd be able to drive there in the Silver Eagle. Meanwhile, would Sam look round for a likely second-hand lorry? It was nearly April, 6 months before the trustee gave up, and nothing definite about the repairs. I wrote to Mr. Barkway again, while feeling I was making a nuisance of myself. If we did the repairs forthwith, I asked, would the cost of labour be recoverable? Mr. Barkway was reassuring. You can be sure of getting the money for doing the repairs from Mr. Strawless's trustee because you will be able to deduct it from the amount of the tenant right valuation, and you are also certain of the rent from the 11th of October 1936 to the 11th of October 1937 because I can distrain for half of it on the farm stock, and the remaining half I can get from the corn. I am glad you have not been farming this year, as it is, without exception, a most difficult one that I have known. I arrived at Creek and stayed at a local inn. I hope that all this is making sense to people, because some of it is just a little, just so. It's some of it is just. It is like going through the small print of a contract every 2 seconds. I arrived at Creek and stayed. Sometimes he's very fluid and his writing is great, and you just go, oh yes, I wanted to get a lorry because we wanted to do this and we wanted to shove them in there, and then we wanted to do this and we wanted to get that up, but we had problems with this because of this happened, so we solved those problems by doing this, by doing that, and having this, and a funny thing happened on the way to the forum because this happened and that happened. We all had a big laugh and it was great. And then on the next day we did that. Some moments he gets going and is in his element, and then suddenly he decides to just bog it down, man. Why do you keep bogging it down? Anyway, sorry. I arrived at Creek and stayed in a local inn. I've forgotten where Creek is. I've forgotten where some of these places are now. Is Creek? This is the place in Devon, isn't it? Nearing it was a row of empty cottages with flint walls and tiled roofs. Making inquiries, I learned that they were empty because condemned by the district council. Why doesn't he say, I learned that they were empty because they were condemned, but because condemned? It's like he misses out words of the English language. They'd been empty for 3 years and would remain so until the landlord agreed to do certain repairs. An old man passing in the street told me they belonged to Matthew Bugg, who wouldn't spend any money on them, so they were condemned by the Rural District Council and shut up. What were they worth? I asked. Would I be willing to pay £100 for them? Asked the old man, looking at me keenly with a sideways glance. I was scared of that glance, and I said I must find out first what was required to be done before the council would permit them to be occupied again. I had read in Stock Breeder that government were offering to give grants up to 2/3 of the cost of reconditioning old cottages, provided they were occupied by farm labourers. The very thing for our own men. Oh, right, so Creek is actually near him. Or is the village near him? I get confused. I called on Mr. Stubberfield. I can't even remember now which one was Barkway and who's Stubberfield. All I remember is Colonel Trelawney is the owner of it. And Stubberfield is the estate agent, isn't he? I called on Mr. Stubberfield and asked him if he would look them over for me and advise me about their value. This time I was determined to do things in a proper manner. Yes, said Mr. Stubberfield, he would look at them for me, and also find out if they were condemned for demolition, for if so, of course, I would not want them. And I suppose he would be thinking soon of doing the repairs to the farm premises? Well, to tell the truth, he'd been rather busy, what with many auctions. Well, who's he talking? And I suppose this is to Mr. Stubberfield, is it? Well, to tell the truth, he'd been very busy, what with so many auctions, farmers going out of business, and valuations of incoming covenants and other things. He'd been meaning to look into it and suggested something to be done, but of course he couldn't agree, he supposed, I knew, with a sideways look at me, that all the repairs that Mr. Barkway had listed in his schedule were the responsibility of the tenant. The farm had been in a bad way when Mr. Strawless took over. Why, Mr. Barkway particularly wanted to rebuild an entire premises which were hundreds of years old. Hadn't I noticed that date, 1682, on one of the yard walls? Nearly 300 years of fair wear and tear, you know, and a crack or two anyway didn't matter, because the walls would be standing for a good many years after both he and I had served our time. Still, something needed doing, and at the first opportunity he was going to slip over and take a look around. Meanwhile, he would write to Mr. Matt Bugg and inquire about the cottages. He'd let me know. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Oh, by the way, as I was going out of the door, I didn't want to sell the farm, did I? The old castle had been bought by someone who wanted the land as well, and he would be willing to consider any price I'd like to suggest. He was a rich man and wouldn't make a fuss about £100 either way. Anyway, there was no harm in asking, was there? Was there? Well, he'd let me know about the cottages. Wait a minute, I don't understand. I'm beginning to lose this. Wait, Williamson owns the farm. Stubberfield is the agent. The agent is now asking him if he wants to sell the farm that he's only just bought. What, because there's somebody else interested in it? It was satisfying to know that I had bought the land when I did. Otherwise, it would have been too late. I told myself, oh, so basically somebody else is interested in the property. Maybe I'm just being a bit thick. We're very close. There's just 2 pages. I'm just going to rattle through that and then stop, because this is it's Friday. 2 days off. I get 2 days off from reading. It's a shame. It's a shame. Oh, my God. I've just seen pages of tables with listings. This is ridiculous. Hearing that a gravel pit near the village was parish property, I went to look at it. The pit was overgrown with trees and bushes, and the road to it was unmade, a muddy cart track. It had not been worked for many years. It would be difficult to get a lorry anywhere near the old grass-grown slopes of the fallen cliffs. There was a chalk quarry by the hovel, or cart shed, of my farm, but Mr. Barkway had told me that the chalk turned to porridge in wet weather. Walking up the street, I met a man who told me that he knew of a pit which I could hire for £25 a year. It had been worked by a big gravel merchant from Welk, but he had not paid his rent, and the owner would give me a chance, having heard I wanted to make up the Castle Farm roads. The old castle was being repaired and altered inside. After the years of enjoying itself as a historic semi-ruin, someone from the Midlands had seen it and thought it was an ideal place to live in. Oh, wait a minute, so he didn't buy the old castle then? The house? He's just bought the land. Oh, and the farm cottages. But he didn't buy the house. Oh, OK, fair enough. He'd seen it before me, but he'd been waiting for the price to go down, when he would be able to buy both farm and house at a satisfactory price. The builders were making a fine job of it, putting in bathrooms into the towers, laying new floors, tearing out the old wasteful heating furnace and putting in a new one with bronze pipes fed by a water softening plant which removed both chalk and carbonic acid from the water. Carbonic acid? Yes, the water had been analysed and it was very nearly the hardest in England. The old pipes were almost fossils, solid with lime. I made a note of the efficient builders. On impulse, I telegraphed for Letitia to come up. I would meet her in Norwich the next day. She would catch the 9:1 from Philly, arrive at Paddington at 1:15 and get the train from Liverpool Street Station, which arrived at Norwich at about 6:30. There I met her and told her about the pit. She advised me to take it. Sam said he had found a lorry. It had been a lorry we used to see passing the house owned by the people who had to take cattle cake and pig meal stores by Philly Station. It was the one that used to stop by Farmer Slee's with what Robbie called the trumpet. In other words, the brakes made a loud vibrating sound. But wasn't that the one that they smashed up? Yes, I think they did bend the front axle, and Sam says the engine blew up or something, and there's no water in the radiator. Also, the steering is worn out. Otherwise, it's not in bad condition, says Sam. The garage man, who took it in part exchange, says that it can be repaired, and he's got a second-hand tipper to fit on it. But you must ask Sam. I don't really know anything about it, said Letitia, with apparent uneasiness. And I'm surprised. Sounds like they just bought themselves an absolute load of old nonsense. While we were waiting before the fire at the inn, a man knocked at the door and asked to see me. He had a small, pale, thin face and looked as though he had a hard time as a boy. In a North Country voice, he said he was a builder who had come down to Startint district which was unexploited. He declared, I'd heard that a group of speculators had recently bought nearly 3 square miles of land along the coast and had been stopped from selling building plots by the new Town Planning Act, which had registered the land as agricultural. Parts of the land had been bought by some local people from the Society of the Preservation of Rural England, who wished to affiliate it to the National Trust, which owned the bird sanctuary at The Point. I asked him if he were one of these speculators. "Oh, no, I'm a stranger here. Foreigner, they call it. My name's Bligh. I'm a builder. I'll do for you as well as anyone else, and cheaper too. All I ask is a chance. If there's a tender going, I'm after it." "Well, I haven't thought about building yet, but I'll let you know if I do. I buy my materials direct, cutting out the middleman. All I ask is a chance. I can save you money." I took his name and address and promised to give him a chance if any tenders were put out. Before we went back the next day, I paid the owner of the pit £10 in advance of half the rent for a year's lease, with the right to sell gravel and sand from it, beginning next Monday. Sam and I would be able to come up shortly with a lorry and begin the remaking of the farm's roads. And that's the end of the chapter. It's a very strange book. Thank you for persevering with me, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, there are moments of it which just fly off very easily and are very nice and simple. And actually, it starts to tell the story, and it's amusing, and it's entertaining, and great. And then there's parts of it where it just sort of, like his farm, gets bogged down in these weeds and these rutted roads and these roof rafters that are falling apart. And you really get this struggle with it, and it's almost as if that's probably by design, very cleverly written, so that you feel the same emotional upheaval and strain and stress and frustration as you plough through it. So you really feel, in a way, in a not metaphysical, but in a comparative, in a what's the word I'm looking for, in metaphor, the same sort of struggle that he has. Shame there's no mention of accents. To be great to hear. Yes, well, I'm just making up my own accents. Yorkshire, see, pay nout, never do nout for nout, aye, lad. It's complicated story, aye. Well, that was unnecessarily hard work for you. Exactly. The next book will be a nice, easy book, as I say. Peter and Jane. Noddy and Big Ears would probably be next. It's more social history than classic literature, says Morton Lewis. It's absolutely, yes. Aye, Morton, what's wrong with that? That's how he can stretch it out and fill a whole book, yes. Well, looking at that, though, I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we are nearly... We're about nearly we're probably a third. Well, I can tell you, we're on page 136 in 400 odd pages. So, okay, not quite a third, just over a quarter. There are some photographs in here, but sadly, there's no references to the photographs. Here we go. I look forward to reading this bit out to you. The schedule before referred to. Oh my giddy aunt. How many pages of that have we got to read? I will skip that. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, it's been lovely to chat to you and what have you. We've got the Vogue show later on with the delightful and very lovely Julia on the show. And she has got a tiny little hole to clamber in, as I have. That's on the show tonight. she will be clambering into that hole next to me there, which is at the moment vacated and waiting for her. Anyway, see all, hear all, say nout, eat all, drink all, pay nout, never do nout for nout. Your wall looks like my garden wall, wondered where the bricks went. Yeah. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much. I'm going to go now because I've got to go and knead some bread and get some food on and be ready for the Voby One-Eyed Kenobi show tonight. If you want to join me, we did have a theme. Hopefully the lovely Julia can remember what it was, because I saw her earlier and we discussed the theme that we were going to talk about, and now I've completely forgotten. So there we go. Anyway, that's it. Good. Have a good weekend if you're not out around later on. I will carry on reading this on Monday. In the meantime, take care and look after yourself. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.